My name is Lily Anderson. I am 32 years old and work as an administrative manager at an art center in Savannah, Georgia. To most people around me, I am the kind of woman who willingly places her family above all else, even above her own career, her own voice, her own dreams. I was proud of that, at least for a long time. I believed in building a warm, peaceful home, and I was convinced that my sacrifices were the foundation of our happiness. My husband, Brandon Carter, is 36, a well-respected vice president of sales at a medical equipment company. He has always been that man people gravitate toward, tall, polished, with just the right words for every situation. Friends and colleagues constantly admired him, calling him the perfect husband, the kind of man every woman should hold on to. For years, I believed them. I believed I had married the man who would walk with me through every season of life, hand in hand. But life has a way of slowly eroding certainties. Brandon and I spent years trying to have a child. Endless doctor visits, painful treatments, emotional exhaustion, each cycle of hope and disappointment carved silent cracks into our hearts. I remember sitting in cold clinic rooms, clutching the edge of the seat as the final test results confirmed what I had long feared. The words were gentle but final. "I'm sorry. There's nothing more we can do." The day we abandoned the treatments, something inside me quietly broke. Though I tried to act as if nothing had changed, it wasn't just us who changed. Fate, too, had its own plans. When my parents passed away suddenly, my father from a heart attack, and just 3 months later, my mother after a battle with illness, I inherited everything. They had worked for a family-owned transportation business and a substantial fortune. I wasn't ready for that responsibility, but I stepped into it because there was no one else. That inheritance transformed our lifestyle overnight. We moved into a beautiful house, drove luxury cars, and traveled to places I had only seen in magazines. From the outside, we looked like the perfect couple with the perfect life. But somewhere along the way, Brandon started drifting away from me. It wasn't abrupt. It was subtle, like a slow leak in a boat. The long conversations faded. The quiet dinners we used to treasure turned into rushed meals or empty chairs. He was always busy, always elsewhere. The warmth in his eyes, the spark that once comforted me, had dimmed. And I foolishly kept convincing myself that this was just a phase, that if I tried harder, loved more, it would pass. Looking back, I realized I had become invisible in my own home. I was holding on to a marriage that had already begun to slip through my fingers, unaware that the man I trusted the most was already writing me out of his life. I used to think that if I tried hard enough, if I poured every bit of myself into saving what we had, things would eventually return to the way they were. But reality, as it turns out, doesn't wait for you to be ready. It simply unfolds, with or without your consent. And when it did, it began with small cracks barely noticeable at first, but soon enough, the cracks became impossible to ignore. Brandon's work trips became more frequent, almost predictable. He was gone nearly every other week, always to handle urgent projects or meet key clients. But whenever I asked where exactly he was going, the answers were vague. "Somewhere out of town," he would say, brushing me off with that half-hearted smile that used to melt me but now felt like a wall. I told myself not to overthink it, that busy seasons come and go. Still, there was a part of me that had already begun bracing for the truth I wasn't yet ready to face. I started noticing changes in his routines. Brandon, who once casually left his phone on the nightstand or the kitchen counter, now kept it with him at all times, even when he showered. He changed his phone's passcode without telling me a detail he would have shared without hesitation in the past. When I asked about it, his face clouded with irritation. "Why do you even need to check my phone? Don't you trust me?" His sharp tone cut deeper than I expected. He had never spoken to me that way before. Financial matters, once fully transparent between us, suddenly became off limits. Brandon, who used to hand me all his credit card statements without a second thought, now told me he would manage them himself. "It's just easier this way," he said, dismissively waving his hand when I pressed. His reluctance felt like a door slowly closing in my face. Still, I tried to hold on to whatever was left. I invited him to lunches near his office, offered to plan quick weekend getaways. Each time, he made some excuse. There were always last-minute meetings or out-of-town conferences. His life, once intertwined with mine, now moved on a track that seemed to deliberately exclude me. The turning point came on an evening I had spent weeks preparing for a gala event hosted by the art center where I worked. It was one of the rare occasions Brandon actually agreed to attend with me. I remember the golden lights, the soft clinking of glasses, the buzz of polite conversation. For a brief moment, I thought perhaps he was making an effort to come back to me. While I mingled with colleagues, Brandon disappeared into the crowd. I found him standing at the edge of the ballroom, speaking in low tones to a man I didn't recognize. I couldn't hear much, but one sentence landed like a hammer in my chest. The Jacksonville plan is almost in place, just a few loose ends. His companion nodded with a knowing smile. Jacksonville Brandon had never mentioned working there. I stood frozen, heart pounding, as he quickly changed the subject when he noticed me nearby. I tried to suppress the gnawing anxiety, telling myself I had misheard, or perhaps misinterpreted. But the next day, Megan, a close colleague who had known me for years, asked if I was all right. When I hesitated, she gently confessed, "Lily, I didn't know if I should tell you this, but I've seen Brandon at the Grandview Hotel in Jacksonville. More than once, always with the same woman, a tall brunette. They seemed familiar, very familiar." Her words sank into me like cold water. My chest tightened, but my mouth could only form a brittle. "Are you sure?" She nodded. Her expression weighted with genuine concern. I didn't want to jump to conclusions, but it didn't look like business meetings. I went home that night and sat in the darkened living room, replaying Brandon's late nights, the secretive calls, the cold distance that had crept into our marriage. Suddenly, the missing pieces began fitting together in a way I could no longer deny. Before I could summon the courage to confront him, Brandon approached me one morning with unexpected tenderness. "I've been thinking," he began, his eyes unusually bright. "We should take a trip, just the two of us. Nashville. Maybe it's time we fix what's broken between us." The suggestion came out of nowhere. For months, he had carefully avoided any meaningful time alone with me. And now, he was proposing a spontaneous getaway as if our problems could be solved with a weekend in a new city. I wanted so badly to believe him. Part of me still clung to the hope that he meant it, that perhaps this was his way of choosing me again. But something inside me had shifted. I no longer heard his promises the way I once did. They no longer sounded like safety. They sounded like a setup. Still, I agreed to the trip. I needed answers, and deep down, I already sensed I was walking toward them. I agreed to the trip, but every part of me knew this wasn't about fixing anything. I wasn't going to Nashville for reconciliation. I was going for answers. And perhaps, I was also going to find the confirmation I had been trying to avoid for far too long. The morning we left Savannah, Brandon appeared unusually cheerful. He packed the car with meticulous care, making sure everything was in place. He even made my favorite coffee and handed it to me with that practiced smile, the same smile I had once trusted without question. But now, it felt more like a well-rehearsed performance. As we drove out of the city, I sat silently, watching the landscape shift from familiar streets to long stretches of highway, each mile pulling me further from the life I thought I knew. Throughout the drive, Brandon's tension was impossible to miss. His hands gripped the steering wheel tighter than necessary. He kept glancing into the rearview mirror, his eyes flicking nervously between the road and something or someone behind us. I asked him once, "Is something wrong?" "You seem distracted." He forced a short laugh, never taking his eyes off the road. "It's just work stress. I guess I can't fully disconnect, even on a trip like this." But his voice betrayed him. There was a tremble in it that hadn't been there before. The phone calls were worse. Brandon barely spoke above a whisper when he answered his phone, using his wireless earpiece to avoid me overhearing anything directly. I caught fragments words like timing, make sure, and on schedule, but never enough to piece together a full sentence. When I leaned closer, he would shift in his seat or raise the window to muffle his voice further. It was as if he was sitting right next to me, but existing in an entirely different world. We stopped for lunch at a small roadside café just outside Birmingham. It was the kind of place where the walls were lined with old license plates and the scent of fresh coffee mixed with the faint smell of gasoline from the station next door. Brandon offered to order for both of us, insisting I wait at our table. But as soon as he walked away, I felt the weight of a presence near me. A young man in a café uniform approached, wiping down the neighboring table. His movements were casual, but his eyes flicked toward me with an urgency that didn't match his calm exterior. As he passed by, he swiftly pressed a small, folded card into my hand and whispered without looking at me, "You're not safe. Don't go back to the car." And then he walked away, disappearing into the back of the cafe. My heart slammed against my ribcage as I carefully unfolded the card beneath the table. In shaky handwriting, it read, "He's planning something. Don't ask questions. Get out now." Panic seized me, but I forced myself to breathe, to think. I scanned the cafe and caught sight of the young man again, standing near the side door, subtly gesturing for me to follow him. Without hesitation, I stood and made my way toward him, my legs trembling beneath me. Out behind the cafe, where the hum of the highway was the only sound, the young man introduced himself in a low, hurried voice. "I'm Noah. 3 weeks ago, I overheard your husband in this cafe. He wasn't careful that day. He was sitting right where you are now with a woman, a brunette. I didn't plan to get involved, but I heard them talking. I heard enough to know you're in serious danger." I stared at him, struggling to absorb his words. What did they say? Noah's eyes darted nervously toward the parking lot before he continued. They talked about an accident, something that would happen on the road to Nashville. He said everything was set. He even mentioned that the psychiatric paperwork was ready, that once you were gone, he'd have the documentation to make it all look legitimate. He said, "It will be quick. When it's over, the assets transfer cleanly." My entire body went cold. I wanted to believe Noah was mistaken, that this was all some terrible misunderstanding. But deep down, I already knew he was telling the truth. Brandon's strange behavior, the secrecy, the trip, it all aligned far too perfectly. "You have to leave," Noah urged. "You can't go back to that car. If you do, you might not get another chance." I pressed my hand against my chest, trying to steady my heartbeat, but the weight of betrayal made it almost impossible to breathe. Brandon's calls, the Jacksonville connection, his relentless distance, it wasn't just emotional neglect. It had been a carefully crafted plan, a trap. Noah's voice softened, but his urgency remained. "I can help you get to a nearby police station, but we have to go now." Brandon's voice suddenly called out from the front of the cafe, closer than I expected. "Lily, where are you?" Noah's eyes locked on mine. "Please, decide now." The years I had spent defending Brandon in my mind, the love I had so desperately clung to, all of it collapsed in that moment. I gave Noah a small, decisive nod. "Help me get out of here." We slipped through the side exit just as Brandon's footsteps grew louder, my heart pounding louder than the sound of the road. I didn't look back. I couldn't. Because somewhere deep inside, I already knew what I would see. I didn't look back as Noah's truck sped away from the cafe. But in my mind, I could still hear Brandon's footsteps, feel the weight of his presence chasing me. My heart pounded relentlessly, and yet, beneath the panic, something else had begun to take root resolve. For the first time, I wasn't running just to escape. I was running to uncover the truth that had been carefully hidden from me. Noah drove us to a small police station in a quiet town nearby. The building was modest, the kind where the local officers knew most of the community by name. I sat across from Officer Reynolds, my hands still trembling as I recounted everything: Brandon's strange behavior, the trip, the warning note, the conversation Noah overheard. The officer listened attentively, his expression serious, but when I finished, his response nearly broke me. "Ma'am, I believe you," he said carefully, "but we can't intervene based on suspicions alone. We need concrete evidence, something we can act on." His words were like a wall slamming shut in front of me. I wanted to scream that I had been living the evidence for months, but I knew he was bound by the law. I wasn't angry at him. I was angry that Brandon had orchestrated everything so well, with just enough distance, just enough control, that no one could touch him yet. I called Megan immediately. I could barely keep my voice steady as I told her everything that had happened, how I had fled, how the police couldn't do much without proof. Megan didn't hesitate. "Lily, I know someone who can help. He's a private investigator. His name is Lucas Bryant. I'll connect you right now, within an hour." I was sitting in a small, cluttered office across from Lucas, a man in his early 40s with a calm voice and sharp, observant eyes. He didn't ask me to prove my story. He just listened, taking detailed notes, nodding occasionally. "I've seen cases like this before," he said, leaning back in his chair. "Sometimes people lead entire double lives, and they're careful, very careful. But nobody's perfect. They always leave something behind." Lucas started his investigation immediately. Over the next few days, he dug into Brandon's financial records, travel history, phone logs, anything he could access legally. I stayed hidden at a safe house Noah's friend offered, waiting for Lucas to return with something, anything that would expose the man I thought I knew. When Lucas finally called me, his voice was tight with urgency. "Lily, we need to meet. I've found something you need to see." At his office, Lucas placed a thick file in front of me. On the cover was a name I didn't recognize: Vanessa Miller. He flipped open the file and pointed to a photograph, a picture of Brandon standing in front of a house in Orlando with a woman and 2 small children, no older than 7 or 8. They were smiling. They looked like a family. "That's his legal wife in Florida," Lucas said quietly. "They've been married for almost 10 years. He's been living a double life. Lily, trips, accounts, time away. He wasn't just lying to you. He was building parallel families." I felt like the floor beneath me gave way. For years, while I planned our future, Brandon had already built another one without me. But the worst wasn't even that betrayal. Lucas handed me another folder, this one containing printed transcripts of Brandon's phone calls, conversations he had with a psychiatrist named Dr. Blake. In the recordings, Brandon detailed the scheme with chilling precision. He had convinced Dr. Blake to fabricate psychiatric records stating that I suffered from delusional disorder, severe enough to justify commitment to a mental health facility. There were discussions about the timeline, about forging signatures, about ensuring the plan would proceed smoothly immediately after the accident. I flipped through the pages, seeing my name scribbled across fake medical forms, diagnoses I had never received, treatment plans I had never agreed to. It was a meticulous construction of a lie designed to erase me from my own life. Lucas's voice pulled me from the haze. "There's more." I traced payments from Brandon's account to Dr. Blake, monthly deposits labeled as consultation fees, but the amounts and frequency don't align with any legitimate services. It's clear he was paying for something else. I felt physically sick, but I wasn't afraid anymore. I was furious. Brandon hadn't just wanted to abandon me, he wanted to destroy me, to strip me of my freedom, my identity, and everything I had worked to build. Lucas leaned forward. "We need to move fast. I recommend freezing all joint assets immediately. I can connect you with a lawyer who specializes in financial fraud and marital deception. Her name is Natalie Rhodes. She's the best." I didn't hesitate. That afternoon, I met with Natalie, a woman whose steady confidence instantly grounded me. She carefully reviewed the evidence and explained our next steps. We'll request a court order to freeze all shared accounts, and we'll file formal charges in both Georgia and Florida. We need to prevent him from transferring assets while we pursue this case. Together, we moved quickly. Natalie drafted the paperwork while Lucas coordinated with local authorities. Within 48 hours, the court approved the asset freeze. For the first time in months, I felt the smallest spark of control returning to my hands. Brandon thought he had written the final chapter of my story, but what he didn't realize was that I was just beginning to write my own. Brandon thought he had control over every piece of the game, but the moment we froze the accounts, his careful architecture began to crumble. Within days, law enforcement located him hiding in a rented motel just over the state line, trying to flee with whatever assets he could still access. Vanessa, his other wife, was also taken into custody to assist with the investigation. The man who once carefully orchestrated every detail was finally out of moves. The trial began just a few weeks later, and it quickly attracted the attention of the local press. Reporters gathered outside the courthouse, cameras flashing, headlines promising betrayal, scandal, and deceit. I walked into that courtroom not as the trembling wife Brandon had tried to erase, but as a woman determined to reclaim her life. The courtroom was cold, but the energy was electric, thick with quiet judgment and curiosity. When they brought Brandon in, his hands cuffed, his usually polished appearance replaced by a wrinkled prison uniform and unshaven face, I barely recognized him. He kept his gaze low, refusing to look at me, as though avoiding my eyes could somehow erase what he had done. I sat beside Natalie, my lawyer, her calm and steady presence anchoring me as the prosecution began presenting the evidence we had worked tirelessly to gather. They played the recorded phone calls between Brandon and Dr. Blake, his own voice detailing the timeline, the forged medical records, the payments, and his casual certainty that I would soon be out of the way. Every chilling detail of his plan was laid bare for the courtroom to hear. I listened in silence, not because I wasn't affected, but because I needed to stay steady, to see this through to the end. My heartbeat thundered in my chest as they displayed the fake psychiatric documents with my name typed across them, the forged signatures, and the detailed instructions Brandon had provided to make the entire fabrication appear legitimate. They presented his financial records' next transfers to Dr. Blake, labeled as consultation fees, though the amounts far exceeded any reasonable payment for such services. There were flight bookings, hotel receipts, credit card transactions that proved his consistent travels to Orlando to maintain his second life with Vanessa. Then came the marriage certificate official, undeniable, showing that Brandon had married Vanessa years before, overlapping with our marriage, living as though both lives could exist without ever colliding. The evidence was overwhelming. Brandon's defense crumbled quickly, his lawyer offering little more than half-hearted denials that didn't stand against the mountain of proof. When Brandon was finally asked to speak, he rose slowly, his voice low and hollow. "I didn't mean to hurt anyone," he said, but the courtroom was unmoved. I didn't flinch. I didn't soften. I had lived in the shadow of his lies long enough. The judge's verdict was clear and resolute. Brandon Carter was sentenced to 9 years in prison for conspiracy to commit murder, financial fraud, and bigamy. Vanessa Miller was sentenced to 4 years for her role in aiding his deception and benefiting from his criminal acts. As the bailiffs led Brandon away, he finally turned to look at me. His face was unreadable, stripped of the charm he once wore so effortlessly. For a brief second, I wondered if he expected me to look at him with the sorrow of a woman who still loved him. But I didn't. I gave him nothing. He no longer had a place in my story. I gripped Natalie's hand tightly, tears forming not from sadness, but from the weight that had finally been lifted. I had survived. I had faced the storm and come out standing. And most importantly, I had reclaimed my life. After the trial, I made the decision to sell the house I had once believed was our forever home. It held too many ghosts, too many memories that no longer belonged to me. With the remaining assets I was able to preserve, I moved to a quiet coastal town in Alabama, a place far from the noise, far from the past. The house I bought there was small, nothing like the sprawling estate Brandon had once admired. But in that modest space, I found peace. I found mornings filled with the soft crash of waves, evenings colored by the sunset over the water, and the kind of silence that healed instead of haunted. Starting over wasn't just about changing addresses. It was about finally living a life where every choice, every step, belonged solely to me. I no longer lived as a shadow in someone else's design. I no longer needed permission to exist fully in my own story. What Brandon had tried to take from me, I rebuilt piece by piece with truth, with courage, and with the steady conviction that I would never again be written out of my own life. Leaving behind the house, the courtroom, and the life I once thought was mine didn't instantly heal me. Healing, I learned, doesn't happen in a single moment. It happens slowly, quietly, in the spaces where you start to breathe freely again. In my small coastal home, where the waves whispered against the shore and the wind carried no weight of old memories, I began to rebuild not just a life, but a sense of who I truly was. In those first months, I lived carefully, cautiously, unsure of how to trust the rhythm of peace. I spent my mornings by the window, watching the ocean stretch endlessly, allowing the calm to settle inside me. But even in that solitude, I couldn't forget the countless others who, like me, might still be trapped in shadows, waiting for someone to reach out and show them there is a way out. One afternoon, while wandering through the quiet streets of my new town, I noticed a flyer pinned to the door of the local library. It read, "Support Group for Women Recovering from Emotional Abuse and Marital Betrayal. Safe space to share and heal." I stood there for a long moment, my fingers brushing over the edges of the paper, as if it had been waiting for me to find it. I walked into the group's meeting the following week with hesitant steps, unsure of what I would say or whether I belonged. But as I listened to other women speak, some with trembling voices, some with eyes hardened by years of silence, I realized I was among those who understood in ways no one else could. For the first time, I spoke my story aloud, not as a victim, not as a warning, but as a quiet testimony that surviving is possible, week after week. I kept returning. The space that had first offered me refuge slowly became a place where I could offer refuge to others. I began guiding new members, connecting them to legal resources, helping them navigate the confusing, painful path I had already walked. I didn't need to save them. I only needed to stand beside them until they found the strength to save themselves. Noah and I kept in touch throughout that time. He finished his degree in aerospace engineering and secured his first job in New Orleans. His messages, though simple, were steady check-ins that reminded me of the courage we both discovered that day at the café. One evening, he invited me to dinner with his mother, Ruth, a woman whose kindness had already reached me through Noah's stories. That dinner was nothing grand, a homemade meal in a modest home filled with warm laughter and genuine conversation. Ruth welcomed me like an old friend, not out of obligation, but simply because she wanted to. As we ate, she spoke openly about raising Noah on her own, about the quiet pride she carried for the man he had become. I listened, realizing that this simple, honest connection was the kind of family I had always longed for. When I left their home that night, the air felt lighter. The road back to my house strangely familiar now, as though I had finally come home. I drove slowly, savoring the quiet, until I reached the overlook near the beach. I stopped the car, stepped out, and walked toward the water. The sky was painted in soft indigo, the waves breaking rhythmically at my feet. I stood there, letting the breeze press against me, not searching for answers, not waiting for anyone's approval. For the first time, I didn't feel the need to prove anything to anyone. I understood then my worth had never been tied to Brandon's validation, nor to the illusion of the life I had so desperately tried to preserve. My value wasn't something that could be granted or revoked by another person. It had always been mine. I closed my eyes, breathed in the salt air, and turned away from the shore. As I walked back to my car, I didn't look back not out of fear, but because I didn't need to. Some doors don't need to be slammed shut. Some are simply left behind, and as I slid into the driver's seat, I knew with absolute certainty true worth doesn't require recognition. Dignity cannot be taken.